And we'd start walking through the streets of Selma, orderly, peacefully. No one saying a word. It was a silent march. It was so disciplined. It was like military discipline. There was no one pushing, no one trying to get to the front of the line. For the most part, we had men at the front, women in the middle, then men in the back. I was wearing a backpack before it became fashionable to wear backpacks. I thought we were going to be arrested and that we were going to go to jail. So in this backpack, I had 2 books because I wanted to have something to read. I had an apple and I had an orange. I wanted to have something to eat in jail. And since I was going to be in jail with my friends, colleagues, and neighbors, I wanted to be able to brush my teeth. I had a toothbrush and some toothpaste. We get to the edge of the Alabama River. Before we walked across the bridge, just to the edge, Jose Williams saw all of this water down below. He said to me, "John, can you swim?" I said, "No." "Can you swim?" And he said something like, "Yeah, though." I said, "Well, Jose, we cannot go back. We must go forward. Let's go." And we continued to walk, crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge. We got to the highest point on that bridge. We saw a sea of blue down below, Alabama State Troopers. And behind the state troopers, we saw members of Sheriff Clark's posse on horseback. Sheriff Clark had requested that all white men over the age of 21 to come down to the courthouse that Saturday night before that Sunday morning to be deputized to become part of his posse to stop the march. We continued to walk. We come within hearing distance of the state troopers. A man identified himself and said, "I'm Major John Cloud of the Alabama State Troopers. This is an unlawful march. It will not be allowed to continue. I give you 3 minutes to disperse and return to your church." And Jose said, "Major, give us a moment to pray." And as we were passing word back to people to kneel and pray, Major John Cloud said, "Troopers advance." You saw these guys putting on their gas masks. And Jose said to me, "John, they're going to gas us." And they came toward us, beating us with nightsticks and bullwhips, trampling us with horses, releasing their tear gas. I was hit in the head by a state trooper with a nightstick that Sunday afternoon. I thought I was going to die. I thought I saw death. I thought it was my last march. I didn't know whether I would make it back. 41 years later, I don't recall how I made it back across the bridge, through the streets of Selma, back to that little church. But I do recall being at the church that Sunday afternoon. The church was full to capacity. More than 2,000 people on the outside trying to get in to protest what had happened. And someone said to me, "Say something to the group. Say something to the audience." And I stood up and said something like, "I don't understand it. How President Johnson can send troops to Vietnam, but cannot send troops to Selma, Alabama, to protect people who only desires to register to vote." The next thing I knew, I'd been admitted to the Good Samaritan Hospital in Selma that afternoon. I stayed there that Sunday evening, Sunday night. Early that Monday morning, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Reverend Ralph Abernathy came to visit me. And Dr. King said, "Don't worry, John. We will make it from Selma to Montgomery." And he told me that he had issued a call for religious leaders to come to Selma. For that Tuesday, the next day, would have been March 9th. I was still in the hospital that afternoon when more than 1,000 ministers, priests, nuns, and rabbis came and walked across the bridge to the point where we had been beaten 2 days earlier. They kneeled, prayed, they turned back. And later that evening, one of the young ministers from Boston, by the name of James Reed, Reverend James Reed, went out with some of his colleagues to try to get something to eat at a little restaurant downtown Selma. They were attacked by members of the Klan. And Reverend Reed was so severely beaten, he was transferred to a hospital in Birmingham, where he died the next day. Because of Bloody Sunday and because of what happened to James Reed, there was a sense of righteous indignation all across America. There were demonstrations in more than 80 cities, at the Department of Justice, at the White House, on college campuses, at American embassies abroad. President Lyndon Johnson was so disturbed, like the American people, he called Governor Wallace to come, George Wallace, who was governor of Alabama at the time, to come to Washington to try to assure him that if we decided to march again, that he would be able to protect us. Governor Wallace could not assure the president. We went into federal court, got an injunction against the governor of Alabama, the sheriff of Dallas County, Alabama, and other state officials for interfering with in the march. And the federal judge by the name of Frank M. Johnson, native of Alabama, a wonderful human being, who gave us everything we wanted, said we had a right to march. And 2 weeks later, on March 21st, more than 10,000 people walked out of the city of Selma, crossed that bridge. More than 300 of us walked all the way. And 4 days later, when we arrived in Montgomery, there were more than 25,000 American citizens, black and white. But Lyndon Johnson, because of that, made one of the most meaningful speeches any American president have made in modern time in the whole question of civil rights, of voting rights. We call it the We Shall Overcome speech. He spoke to a joint session of the Congress, spoke to the nation. He started that speech off that night, and I was sitting with Martin Luther King Jr. in the home of a local family in Selma when we heard Lyndon Johnson started that speech. He started that speech off that night by saying, "I speak tonight for the dignity of man and for the destiny of democracy." To paraphrase him, he said something like, "At times, history and fate meet in a single place in man unending search for freedom. So it was more than a century ago at Lexington and at Concord. So it was at Appomattox. So it was last week in Selma, Alabama." And President Johnson went on to talk about the power of the greatest nation on the face of the earth, have heard the moans and the groans of an oppressed people, and we are prepared to act. He condemned the violence in Selma. He condemned the killing of Reverend Reed. He introduced the Voting Rights Act. And before he concluded that speech, Lyndon Johnson said it more than once, "And we shall overcome." That was the first time to hear a president of the United States using the theme song of the Civil Rights Movement when he said, "And we shall overcome." I looked at Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., tears came down his face, he started crying, and we all cried it. We all cried just a little when we heard President Johnson say, "And we shall overcome." And Dr. King said again, "We'll make it from Selma to Montgomery."